Grayson here, back at it again with another week of science, news, and live debating. So, you might know that kind of did a slightly different show last week, had a few friends on, laughed at a new prophecy, but we're back at it again with our regularly scheduled programming this week. We're going to be going over some of the science news from the last 2 weeks because I missed last week. And then tonight's not going to be an open stream where anybody can join to do the live debates. Tonight we have a special guest, Matthew, whose channel I've linked below in the description. And I'm really looking forward to this one. Matthew is, I believe, a philosophy student who's a lot more well-versed in philosophy than I am. I'm more of on the empirical science side, but I always like learning new things. And Matthew is a little bit abnormal in that he's a more generalized theist. So he's not a Christian or a Muslim. He's just your general philosophical theist. So I haven't talked to any generalized theists before on this channel. So this should be a pretty good and fun, entertaining conversation. Hopefully I can learn a little bit about philosophy. He's going to be talking about what are some of his favorite arguments for the existence of God. And you guys know, if you saw my fine-tuning video, that I've been wanting to do a debate on fine-tuning. So hopefully we'll be able to cover that. But that won't start until 8 o'clock, which is in 30 more minutes. So we'll go over some of the science news from this week and then hopefully get into that discussion with Matthew. Should be a really fun stream, guys. So stay tuned and stay strapped in. First of all, I just want to say, because I mentioned it 2 weeks ago during the stream and I forgot to mention it last week, but I did get channel memberships set up. So hopefully it's all working and you guys are able to see a little join button where you could join as a member. So hopefully you guys let me know if you are able to see that join button. I think I got all the kinks worked out and memberships are available now. And there's some pretty fun emotes. You guys can spam based emote or the face palming Jesus and a cringe emote. So should be a lot of fun. Anyways, enough with the formalities. Let's get into some cool news in science and history. So first of all, it's been, oh, well, look at that. Already off the bat, we've got Justin from Yahooligan gifting 5 base theory memberships. Awesome. The memberships are working. Very, very exciting. Yeah. So you guys are all here for a historical stream right now. First memberships for base theory passing out. Thank you, Justin. Now I know it works. We're all golden. So the first science news that I wanted to highlight is actually from archaeology. It's been a minute, I think 3 weeks or something since we last highlighted an archaeological finding. And there were 2 from the last 2 weeks. 2 archaeological findings, both for the Great Pyramids of Giza. So you guys, I mean, you know, Egyptian civilization is one of my favorite ancient civilizations. And the pyramids are one of the most amazing sights that you could possibly see on Earth today, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's not often that we get new discoveries about them, but you guys know that the pseudoscientists out there love talking about how the pyramids, nobody understands how they were built. They must have been built by aliens or ancient civilizations like Atlantis or something. But this last 2 weeks, we've got a series of really cool papers here. Let me share my screen and show you guys the first one because there were 2 independent studies, both using ground penetrating radar, that both made some really awesome discoveries just in the last 2 weeks. So this first one here was a discovery that basically it had been hypothesized for a long time that the way that they actually got the materials to the pyramids was floating them on a river. But the Nile is still kind of pretty far away from the site of the pyramids. And so they just found evidence that there was a second tributary to the Nile that is no longer existent today, that passed right by the site of the pyramids, which they would have floated that material down, so they didn't have to log it over land. And then they can just bring it up a long series of ramps that were built from the earth, and they could, you know, decrease the friction by wetting the sand in front of the pyramids. So it's not some huge mystery about how these things were built. And here, just in the last 2 weeks, they found actual evidence using ground penetrating radar of the actual branch of the Nile, which no longer exists, which is called the Aramat Nile branch. That was just my stab at pronunciation there. So that was the first one. Very cool. Figuring about more about how the pyramids were built. But this second one, I think, gets me even more excited. It could just turn out to be a nothing burger. Don't get your hopes up too much. But this second discovery really makes me want to see what'll happen next. So again, this was ground penetrating radar. So this was not an actual excavation. But using ground penetrating radar in the area around the pyramids, they were able to find an anomaly where there's a site of extreme low density in this area. See how there's all of these different graves and tomb sites all around this, but nothing here in this area. And you can even see that reflected. Here it is next to the pyramids. You can see, I mean, this was a very well used area by the pyramids for different graves, except for this one area where it's looking like there's some sort of man made structure down there. It's unclear if this is like a chamber or it's filled with sand or what is going on here. You can see here's a picture of it where it's just this really empty looking area next to all of this other construction. And this was, very valued real estate being buried next to the pyramid. So for them to be saving this prime patch of land here, they had to be using it for something. And we've seen that there are these two kinds of structures located underneath the sand here that they saw through this radar. And guys, I really, really hope that they will excavate this soon in the next few years because, I mean, I'm curious off the charts. I've even seen some people speculating that maybe a pharaoh is buried beneath here, like maybe the true tomb of Khufu. I'm not that optimistic because, if Khufu was the pharaoh who built the pyramids, why wouldn't he just have his tomb inside the pyramids that he literally spent his whole life building? So I don't know about anything about the tomb of a pharaoh, but maybe the tomb of a very important person. And it's not every day that you can unearth a new ancient Egyptian tomb. So whatever this is, I cannot wait. I'm waiting on bated breath to see what they will uncover when they finally break ground here. It could just, like I said, just be a nothing burger filled with sand or extra construction equipment or something, but I really am. I got my fingers crossed for a new ancient Egyptian tomb in the 2020s. That would be phenomenal. So, yeah, those were the two archaeological studies that I wanted to highlight this week. Really exciting stuff coming out of Egyptian archaeology. You love to see it. It's one of the, best dug places on Earth, and they're still finding new stuff in the 2020s. So that is extremely cool. So now let's go away from archaeology into physics, maybe some astrophysics here. And we can see that another one of Einstein's predictions was verified. So this one, again, had to do with black holes. It feels like we've been having a lot of new discoveries about black holes so far this year, and it continues to deliver. So this falls out of the mathematics of general relativity, that when calculating the sort of dynamics that happen around a black hole, that we're all familiar with the event horizon, which is just the distance from which light can no longer escape. So it just gives the black hole that overall look of being a black hole. But there's another important distance farther away from that, where which light can still escape, but matter cannot. Matter cannot accelerate fast enough to get out of this zone called, the plunging region. And then just this last week, there was emissions that were analyzed that were verifying the predictions of the plunging region for these black hole observations. And so there's currently no other explanation for this other than the mathematics of general relativity and the plunging region. So pretty incredible, still, over 100 years. And Einstein is still making verified predictions about current astrophysics just as of last week. So, I mean, this is really cool to see, just a verified, tested prediction so long. I mean, general relativity really is the gift that keeps on giving, right? But for this next story, right, we're actually going to see if we can go beyond general relativity. You guys know that one of the areas of science that I most want to see progress being made in my lifetime is quantum gravity, right? I've talked about it a couple times, and like I understanding what is going on with gravity on a quantum level would just deepen our understanding of the nature of reality to such an incredible degree. Not just for our understanding of gravity, but also our understanding of what space and time actually is could be potentially revolutionized depending on what quantum gravity actually is and how it behaves. So there's been a couple different experimental approaches that have been proposed in recent years for ways that quantum gravity could be detected in experiment. Most of these have to do with entanglement. So you get something in a superposition and you measure its gravitational effects, or you entangle two particles together where they could only have interacted gravitationally, and then you measure the effects and see what sort of quantum nature this gravitational interaction has. But there are big problems with actually carrying out experiments of those types. And so this new experiment that has not been conducted yet, but this is an outline for how one could conduct such an experiment to probe the quantumness of gravity without entanglement. So this was a really cool new idea, sort of a third way of doing these quantum gravity experiments. And you can see the basic idea here, where it kind of looks like a Cavendish experiment, which we've gone over before on this channel. In my debate with Whitsitt, I went over sort of the ins and outs of how the smallest Cavendish experiment is carried out, and that lab at the University of Vienna is actually one of the ones that have been trying to probe this quantum gravity scale. And this is a slightly different variant because you can see here that there's not just one torsion pendulum, there's two. So like each one of these is what is basically done in these very small Cavendish experiments. But there's two of them now, and there's this electromagnetic shield, this Faraday shield, which is seen in the other one that I've gone over before. But now that you have both, you can measure what effects the sort of the quantum uncertainties have at this level, and you can see that there are actually different observed results depending on how quantum-like gravity behaves on this level. So really, really cool stuff. This is like a totally new idea for a direction to experimentally test quantum gravity. So this could be potentially really fruitful. I don't know exactly what the roadblocks are to setting up an experiment like this, because, like I said, out of the University of Vienna, it seems like they may have done similar experiments using similar apparatus on this sort of scale. And so we will see what the next few years come out with as scientists maybe try to test this new experimental setup. And let's see what kind of results we get. I mean, I don't know. Definitely was not expecting us to have any sort of working understanding of quantum gravity within like the next, 10 or 20 years. So I was just hoping, sometime before I'm like 80, that maybe we could make some progress on it. So if that did come within the next, 5 years or something, that would be incredible. I think that there's probably nothing I would like to see more than that. So there was some of our news on the physics front. Now we can move on to some biology news out of China, specifically some neurobiology that is pretty exciting. Oh, let me close out of this ad. Okay. So there's a new technique that freezes brain tissue without causing actual tissue damage. This has been, tried many, many times before, but this team out of China is claiming that they have successfully done this with organoids, which are sort of stem cell grown brain tissue. So you can see here, they take the living brain tissue, they grow organoids, and then essentially they try to do a broad screening for different chemical baths that they could bathe these brain cells in to see if any of those would help to prevent actual tissue damage during a very quick freezing process with liquid nitrogen. And so they were able to find a certain chemical mixture using like DMSO, ethylene glycol, a couple other chemicals here that did actually seem to make it so where you could freeze brain tissue and then thaw it out without causing actual tissue damage. So I don't know what you guys' first thought was with this, but obviously my first thought was, free, cryo freezing, Walt Disney's brain, etc. And yeah, really exciting stuff potentially for its ramifications. I'm always a little bit skeptical. Big claims like this. So we'll see if it can be repeated. But yeah, really exciting if they've learned a way to preserve brain tissues. I'm not sure exactly why this particular combination would have this effect. I do want to look more into exactly why this combination of DMSO and ethylene glycol, etc., is having this preservative effect. But speaking of DMSO, I know that there has been a lot of buzz lately about DMSO found in the atmosphere of a certain exoplanet, and JWST just recently went back to reanalyze this planet to see if it could learn anything more, because DMSO, as far as we know on Earth, is not produced by any non-living thing. So there's not a known naturalistic process that is capable of creating DMSO on Earth yet. So seeing DMSO in the atmosphere of an exoplanet got a lot of people really excited about potentially life on that planet. Now, since that was first announced, we have then seen DMSO occurring on like a comet. So it's kind of starting to seem like maybe there's just some unknown natural mechanism that maybe doesn't involve living things that's capable of creating DMSO. Um, we shall see what James Webb discovers there. But yeah, a very exciting time for exoplanet research. And speaking of James Webb Space Telescope, we have to cover some of JWST's newest discoveries from the last week, because I mean, JWST is just the gift that keeps on giving. It has made so many discoveries just since it's been online, and it just keeps making new discoveries. Really, really exciting stuff always seems to be coming out of JWST data. So here we have another JWST analysis of an exoplanet. These ones are these puffy exoplanets, and these are very low density exoplanets that they've been seeing for like the last decade or so, where they essentially are way too large for the amount of mass that they have. Like they're so low energy, so they're so low density that it was kind of a struggle to explain what were the dynamics involved that were shaping these planets to be this way. What was going on? And so JWST at least helped shed light on one in particular, which every exoplanet has like the worst name ever, but this is WASP 107b. So this is a giant Neptune-like planet that just has really, really low mass. And so yeah, JWST just recently turned its gaze and discovered that its core was actually a lot larger and a lot hotter than would be normal for another planet of that we were thinking, at least. And so they found that the amount of methane in this planet's atmosphere was like 1,000 times lower than expected. And what this implies is that essentially this core is being heated way beyond normal by tidal forces. So basically like the gravitational forces, as it goes around its revolution, are stretching and contracting this core and heating it up and causing this atmosphere that is like mostly lighter elements to just expand much, much larger than we would expect otherwise. So JWST, this does not necessarily apply to every puffy planet. This one is not really the typical puffy planet. It's a lot more Neptune-like than other ones are. But at least for this planet, JWST was able to shed light on what kind of dynamics are actually at play here. And actually, it just kind of blows my mind that JWST is able to teach us about the interior cores of distant exoplanets so far away. So yeah, I don't know who this guy is. in the chat here who keeps talking about chicken talons or something. But yeah, could you stop doing that? It's getting weird, and I don't know what you're talking about. So, one other discovery from James Webb was actually here. Let me just send this link off to Matthew, make sure that he's going to be coming on. And then I will share my screen here for another James Webb discovery that was just made a couple days ago, where JWST observed the most distant black hole merger ever seen before. So, this is essentially JWST, when it first came online, one of the big takeaways was that these black holes are way bigger than we thought, way earlier than we thought. And it's looking like potentially the seeds of these black holes formed a lot faster than had been worked out in the framework. But the role of mergers seemed like a more natural explanation for how these black holes could get so large, because when two black holes merge, obviously they become one larger black hole. So it seemed like mergers played a large role in the earliest history of these black holes in explaining how they could get so large so quickly. And this is the earliest one that we've seen of a pure black hole merger example. And yeah, really exciting stuff. This is from within the first billion years of the universe's history. So it's showing the role that black holes, and specifically black hole mergers, had so early on in the universe's history. So yeah, JWST keeps powering away. And we did have a couple more science news to cover, but I see that our guest is backstage here. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome him on if he's ready. And yeah, we can get a good discussion underway. So Matthew, I'm gonna add you to the stream. How are you doing, sir?
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty well. Usually on Thursday evenings, I do a live stream where we kind of go over the science news that happened in the week, and then we open it up for more of a live debate or discussion. And so this week, it's not going to be opened up for everybody, but I just discovered you when you called in, as well as I did, to the Capturing Christianity open call-in show. And then I sort of saw your channel, saw some of your videos about your arguments for the existence of God. And I thought, wow, I really want to talk to this guy, because normally on this channel, I probably spend too much time talking with young earth creationists. And
oh yeah, no, don't talk to those guys. They don't know anything.
Yeah, their version of God is really easy to argue against, because there are empirical data like the Noah's flood didn't happen, Adam and Eve didn't happen, these kinds of things. When you have this really rigid dogmatic like reading of a literal event of the Bible, that's a lot easier to show the evidence that goes against it. But I've never actually had on or spoken with someone that is a more general theist, and is coming at this from more of like a philosophical arguments rather than just going back and forth on the empirical evidence. So I was really interested in talking with you. And so I had heard, and I want to get a little bit more about your background before we get into the meat of things here. But I had heard that you started off as an atheist or an agnostic, and then were eventually convinced by a couple philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was an atheist for around 20 years. Then or more like 19 years. Then I sort of became an agnostic in the last year or so. And then I became a theist. And it was as a result of various philosophical arguments.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit about your atheism and agnosticism, I guess. So were you raised in a Christian household or a theistic household, or were you just raised in the absence of theism, or how did you become an atheist, I guess?
So my family, I come from a family. So my parents are Jewish, and they're not secular in the sense that, for example, they go to temple, they take it relatively seriously, but they don't literally believe that there is a perfect God who made the universe. They kind of are uncertain about, at least my dad is, about the existence of God. So, my family isn't that religious and isn't super sold on the idea that there's a God. And so that was kind of how I was raised. And, when I was like 10 or 11 or something, I watched various atheistic YouTubers like Cosmic Skeptic. And I sort of over time, read more about the philosophy and just ended up concluding that atheism I thought was supported by the evidence. And then I've sort of changed my mind on that.
So I'm interested in this because I also got really interested into theist discussions on YouTube, sort of in my middle school years. But I would like to get your take on. So I've seen a few geneticists or like genetic studies that have claimed that there's somewhat of a genetic predisposition towards religious belief. Do you think that when you were younger, what was motivating you to get interested into this area? Do you think that you were in any way predisposed or inclined to believe that atheism by itself was missing something, and that you were sort of inclined to believe in the existence of God? Or do you not feel like that is any way a part of your personality?
Yeah, I don't think that's really a part of my. I mean, to be honest, I was really sold on that there was no God. It's hard to assign exact credences to things, but like this. But I thought that the odds that there was a God was sort of almost zero for, up until I was maybe 17 or 16 or something. I thought there basically weren't any good arguments. And then, over time, I concluded there are some good arguments, but they're outweighed by the problem of evil. But yeah, I mean, I actually think I'm sort of psychologically disposed towards atheism, where, I think I'm a little bit, cynical and pessimistic, and I find it very psychologically difficult to believe, even when I think it's supported by the evidence. But
okay, yeah. So was it your study of philosophy that took you from atheism to agnosticism, or because you're currently a philosophy student, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So you would say, so what kind of, what drove you, what were the first sort of arguments that you encountered that you were like, actually, that is a good argument, and kind of got you towards agnosticism?
So, I mean, one that I think is good that was kind of early on, and, this one, everyone knows about it for, who's thought seriously about it, but I think the fine-tuning argument is a very good argument. And I think that most of what's said in response is unconvincing. I guess the three that kind of moved me the most were kind of early on, and this has sort of remained what convinced me, are first the fine-tuning argument, second an argument called the argument from psychophysical harmony. That one we could talk about, but I find it gets very technical and gets kind of tricky. And then the last one is an argument that a friend and I are working on a paper on, called the anthropic argument. And so the idea of the anthropic argument, just to summarize it briefly, is that anthropic reasoning is how to reason about your own existence. And there's a view of anthropics known as the self-indication assumption. And what the self-indication assumption says is that given that you exist, all else equal, you should think that more people exist. So here's an example to illustrate how the self-indication assumption differs from other views. Suppose that someone flips a coin, and if the coin comes up heads, one person gets created. And if it comes up tails, 1 million people get created. Suppose you get created as a result of this process. The self-indication assumption says that your credence in tails should be 1 million times your credence in heads, because on account of there being 1 million times as many people, it's 1 million times likelier that you would be created. So I think that the self-indication assumption is correct. And the self-indication assumption, it's not like a theist thing. It's adopted by lots of atheists. And I just think it's obviously correct. And I thought this when I was an atheist. And I think once we think the self-indication...
Sorry.
Yeah, can I just... Yeah. So the idea is, once we think that the self-indication assumption is correct, you think that your existence gives you evidence that more people exist. Well, so then suppose this gives you, by this standard, remember, 1 million times as many people is 1 million times as likely as one person. By this same standard, infinite people is infinite times likelier than any finite number of people. So the self-indication assumption gives you reason to think that there are infinite people. And it actually gets worse, because there are some infinites that are bigger than other infinites. So you should think that the number of people is whatever the biggest infinite is, or at least the number of infinite that corresponds to the number of possible people. And then once you have that in place, that there's this huge infinite of people, that it's more than that it's, this very large infinite that there isn't any practical way to get it on naturalism, while perfect God can make that number of people, then I think it ends up majorly favoring theism. So the idea is the self-indication assumption gives you reason to think that the number of people that exist is the most that there could be. And then theism is the best explanation of that fact.
Okay. So I think maybe we should focus on the one that you just unpacked there first, because you just unpacked it, and then maybe we get to fine-tuning, because I definitely do want to talk about fine-tuning. But this one that you just went through is very, I'll say, unique. I have not heard this argument before, but I already have some things that are not quite clicking with me about it. So for the first point, right, this self-indication assumption, let me try to illustrate it with an example of why I'm questioning if this is real or not. Because if there's, you're saying that if there's something that's very improbable that happens, then it's somewhat indicative that there are other instances. Like, so here, if I took a plate, like a dinner plate, and I smashed it on the ground, and I say, look at exactly how that plate smashed, there are potentially, there's a huge trillions of different ways that plate could have smashed, down to the molecular level. Like, I would never be able to get a plate to smash that exact way. So the odds that plate smashing that way are incredibly small. But you're saying that would imply that I've actually smashed like an infinite number of plates in order to make the probability that I got that exact breaking pattern more likely to have occurred. Am I understanding that that's
So no, I don't think it would imply that, because when evaluating some evidence, what you're supposed to do is take the most specific version of the evidence. So the most specific version of the evidence isn't just that the plate got smashed at some time, but that the plate got smashed, that the plate got smashed now. And then if you have that, then no matter how many times, if you smashed it a bunch of times yesterday or whatever, that doesn't affect the probability that you would smash it now. Or if you posit that there's a big multiverse, that doesn't raise the probability that you would smash the plate. It raises the probability that someone would smash it, but it doesn't raise the probability that you in particular would do the smashing of the plate.
Why not? I mean, it seems like if there was a multiverse, then an infinite number of me's would smash an infinite number of plates.
Well, right. So in a multiverse, there would be so it'll depend on what you mean by you. Right. But I'm just saying the version of you that's in this universe, the probability of that one smashing the plate isn't affected by the number of other universes there are in the multiverse.
Okay. And so what you're saying that if there are an infinite number of people, then that makes it seem like God is more likely. But last time I checked, there aren't an infinite number of people. So how do you square that with the prediction that a God would make infinite amount of people?
Well, I claim there are an infinite number of people. They're just not all on Earth. So
how can you claim
they're in the multiverse? Well, the argument for it is that the self-indication assumption means that your existence gives you infinitely strong evidence that there are infinite people. And we don't have any disconfirmatory evidence, because if the people are elsewhere in the universe or in the multiverse, then you wouldn't expect to observe them. Right? So it's not like they're, the claim's not that there are infinite people on Earth. So you wouldn't observe them if they were elsewhere in the multiverse.
So this is not falsifiable then, right?
Well, I think it is falsifiable. So, we have to be careful on exactly what we mean by whether it's falsifiable. So
we can never falsify that. You're saying that there is an infinite number of people. I'm saying there's like 8 billion people, and like you're saying that there's an infinite amount of them, but you can never be aware of them. Like you can never go and see them or measure them or anything.
So I guess it would be unfalsifiable in that sense. But that's a sense in which there are lots of permissible theories that are unfalsifiable. So, for example, I think that there are certain nebula that recede beyond the outside of the observable universe, such that we can't see them. I think they still exist. That's unfalsifiable in the sense that we won't be able to observe if they still exist. But I think that it's perfectly legitimate reasoning, because even though we won't be in a position to observe if the nebula exist, our best theory of reality, the one that makes the most sense of our observations and most strongly predicts our observations without sacrificing things like simplicity, predicts that those nebulae will continue to exist. And so in a similar sense, our best theory of reality that most strongly predicts your existence in particular out of the infinite number of possible people is one that says every possible person exists. And then from that, you should think that theism gets a big problem.
Can you clarify about why the broken plate was not a good analogy for this? Because I'm not sure the difference between you saying, well, look, I exist. It's very, very improbable out of the potentially, the trillions amount of potential humans that could exist, that one out of those trillions is me and that I exist right now. How is that different from saying, well, out of the trillions of different ways that a plate could break, the way that it broke right here when I threw it on the ground means that there are trillions of other plates being broken that we can't see right now?
So, well, when you say trillions of other plates being broken, so what's the hypothesis? Is it that there are lots of other versions of you in the multiverse?
No, just lots of other people that are breaking plates, that because I broke this plate and it got in this exact, very improbable configuration when I broke it, then that somehow would imply that there are trillions of other plates also being broken. It doesn't matter how.
Wait, sorry. And just to clarify, who, like, you're saying there are other people in this universe who are breaking plates. You think maybe it gives you evidence for that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm agnostic about the existence of a multiverse. So,
well, sorry, I'm just asking. You're trying to compare it to some other to inferring something else, and I'm not sure what you're trying to say that is the analogous thing that we should infer. Like, what is it that there are lots of other people breaking plates in this universe, or?
I don't know. I don't think it matters if they're in this universe or a multiverse, to be honest.
Okay.
Because you're positing
that there are lots of other people breaking.
Wait 1 second, Matthew. Because you're positing that there's an infinite number of people somewhere else that we can't get to, we don't have access to. And that could be in this universe, or it could be a multiverse, or wherever, somewhere beyond our ability to actually interact with. So I'm just saying the same thing. I don't know who these people are, but they're breaking trillions of plates, and that's why I got this exact pattern of breakage. Is that not analogous to your argument?
Yeah. So we have to be careful in drawing distinctions. So on the one hand, suppose you know that there are like infinite people in the universe. Well, the theory that there are more people breaking plates, that theory will get a big probabilistic boost, right? Like, suppose you're considering two hypotheses. Hypothesis one is there's only one guy in the universe who ever breaks a plate, and the second hypothesis is everyone in the universe at some point breaks a plate. Well, the second hypothesis much more strongly predicts that you in particular will break a plate, because what's the odds that you'd be the one lucky guy out of infinity people to break the plate? Now, it doesn't give you a reason from the fact that you break a plate. So once you know the number of people that exist, then you should think, all else equal, you get an update in favor of theories according to which a larger share of them break plates from the fact that you break plates. Just like, if you get contracted disease and you don't know how prevalent it is, all else equal, that should increase the sort of expected prevalence of the disease, because that more strongly predicts that you would get it. Now, that said, in the plate example, you don't get a reason to think that there is a greater number of extra people. So you shouldn't, like, suppose you shouldn't think there are an extra 1,000 people once you find out to break plates, once you find out that you break the plate, because that doesn't raise the probability that you in particular would break the plate. It just raises the probability that someone would break the plate. And so if you are this specific person, the one located here, just the hypothesis according to which there are more other people breaking plates, in total, that doesn't increase the probability that this specific person would break the plate.
Okay.
Sorry, so I know it's sort of confusing.
Yeah, this is. I'm finding it very difficult to track this argument. As specifically, it seems like it follows from this argument that there's an infinite number of people that I don't see any reason to think that there are. I mean, maybe you're saying that this argument is a reason to think that there are infinite people, but all I'm seeing is 8 billion. So how does this get to God?
Well, the argument gives you a reason to think that there are infinite other people. And then once you think that there are infinite other people, then and not just a small infinite, right? A very large infinite, then theism is the best explanation of that fact. Because if there's a God, that God would be expected to make all possible people, or at least a sizable share of the possible people. Well, if there's no God, just on naturalism, that would be very, very unlikely.
Well, no, why would we expect a God to make any amount of people?
So plausibly creating a person is a good thing, right? It's good when so I think lots of people have the moral intuition that just the extra addition of a happy person to the world is a good thing. Now, even if you're uncertain about it, even if you think that there's, say, only a 30% chance that this is right, and I'll be happy to go into an argument for why I think from very minimal moral principles you can show that that creating a happy person is good. There's a paper that I recently got to revise and resubmit on where I argue for this, that the addition of a happy person to the world is a good thing. But the idea is that once you, even if you think there's only like a 30% chance that the creation of a happy person is a good thing, well, then that means there's a 30% chance that God would create all possible people. But the odds on naturalism are way lower that every possible person would be created. Well, if you think about the ways that naturalism would have to work in order to create all possible people, it's only a very small share of the possible ways. You need these very creative laws that somehow give rise to uncountably infinite people, when just the simplest laws, well...
Does a multiverse not do that?
So a multiverse might give rise to infinite people, but it doesn't give rise to the right number of infinite, right? So, remember, some infinites are bigger than others. The infinite that is the number of possible people, it's a very large infinite. It's known as Beth2. So the smallest infinite is Beth0, and then Beth1 is bigger than that, and Beth2 is even bigger than that. You can show that the number of possible people is at least Beth2, which is more than the number of real numbers. So the real numbers are include infinite non-repeating decimals.
Why would the number of people be at Beth2 instead of Beth0?
So the reason is that so there are at least one. So there are points on a line, and for each of an infinite number of points, you could imagine just a distinct person with that height, right?
Yep.
And so that means that the number of distinct possible copies of me has to be at least Beth1, because the number of points on a line is at least Beth1. And because you could have a person for each of the subsets of the arrangements of points, it has to be at least Beth2. So, sorry, I know this is very confusing. The math proof it's slightly technical, and it's the type of thing that requires explaining a bit about set theory, and I think it would be very boring. If people are curious, there's a paper called Anthropics and Modal Anthropics and Modal Realism, I think, by I forget the person's name, and that's also linked in my article on the subject, where if you just go to my blog, which is called Bentham's Newsletter, and you type in the anthropic argument for theism, you can find it, and I link to that paper which describes the proof. But it is a sort of technical proof that no one will be following, and it doesn't make very good TV. Yeah.
Really quick, we kind of seem to have a crazy person in the chat here. So I don't want to block people, but stop spamming the chat crazy stuff. I mean, yeah, I don't really block people on here, but normally my chat's not this bad. So yeah, I don't know what's going on tonight, but I might have to get on YouTube and block him because it's just not an entertainment experience for anybody. Just listen to this guy's craziness. So
people tend to get really excited about the anthropic arguments. So they tend to just be worth
yeah. I gotta go and block this guy real quick, which is a shame. I think this is the first person that I've blocked as
wow, crowning moment.
Just remove them.
First time for everything.
Oh no, that doesn't message him. Sorry guys for the lull in the conversation there. Put user in a timeout. There we go. Anyways, so to be honest, we can maybe go back to this argument. To me, I'm struggling with the conclusion here that there must be infinite people. I think because to me, improbable things happen all the time, and it doesn't imply that there were more instances. I mean, you have to get an outcome. So it doesn't. I mean, I'm struggling with the very first. What did you call it? The
self-indication assumption.
Yes, I'm struggling with that because to me, it doesn't imply that there were other instances just because something improbable happened. So I'm struggling with thinking that just because it's very improbable that somebody with my exact personality and brain structure and every atom in place or whatever, because that's very improbable relative to all the potential humans that could exist, then that somehow implies that there's an infinite number of humans that really do exist. This is the leap in logic that is breaking down for me.
Yeah, right. So the self-indication assumption, it's somewhat controversial, but I think it's supported by very convincing arguments. So let me just walk you through one that's fairly simple to describe. So okay, so here's I think a reasonable test case for the self-indication assumption. So imagine God flips a coin. If the coin comes up heads, he creates one person. If it comes up tails, he creates a billion people. You get created from this process.
Yeah.
I think if the self-indication assumption is true, then you should think tails is a billion times as likely as heads.
Well, no, when you set it up like that, and I understand that those are the two options, then yeah, if I exist, then it's more likely that I was created along with a billion people than just myself. I get it when you set it up like that. I just don't know if that's analogous to reality.
So why? Because to me, it seems like that case is analogous to reality, where the explanation of why you should think the coin came up tails in that case is that means that more people will exist, and then if more people exist, that makes your existence more likely. But if that's true, then that implies that more people existing in reality is more likely.
Yeah, but it seems like only 8 billion people exist. So
well, but we don't know if only 8 billion people exist. That there are only 8 billion people that we see, but the universe might be infinite in size, and it actually seems like the universe being infinite in size, I think, and you probably would know better than I, but my sense is that that's what's pointed to, at least tentatively, by our best physics. And then, maybe there's a multiverse, and there certainly can be if there's a God, there can be a very large multiverse.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that overall space-time curvature appears flat is suggestive of a potential infinitely sized universe. However, I have heard really, really good arguments that there's sort of an argument from entropy about all of the different potential states of the universe to be in terms of its curvature. A spatially flat universe is the most likely based on entropy and just like the second law of thermodynamics, basically. So I've heard some really good arguments like that. Neil Turok has a paper on it that's really good, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. I would like to, because I'm a little bit lost on this argument. I'll be honest.
Yeah,
just to me, I think that like you can say that it's possible that an infinite number of people exist and we just aren't aware of them or don't have access to them. But for me, that just seems like the most pragmatic thing would say, well, until we have any evidence of the existence of any more people other than the ones on Earth, then it seems reasonable to think, tentatively, until more data comes out, that there's only 8 billion people. That seems the most logical conclusion to me.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I don't agree with that, because I don't think we don't. I think I disagree with you that we don't have any evidence that there are more than 8 billion people. I think we do have evidence, which is the fact that you exist, and then that's more strongly predicted if there are more people. And you were saying, well, the difference is we've only observed like 8 billion people, so we shouldn't infer more people. I mean, think back to the coin flip case. Imagine that all the people created, they're all sort of in their own separate rooms where they can't see anyone else. Yeah. In that case, I mean, it sounds like you agree that tails is a billion times likelier than heads. But in that case, a person could reason the same way. They can say, I only see meat, so I have no evidence about whether it came up heads or tails.
Yeah. I think that would be a reasonable conclusion based on their evidence, though.
Okay. So then let me give the argument for why we should think that in that case, that your credence in the coin coming up tails should be a billion times your credence in the coin coming up heads. Okay, so because I think there is an argument, and it's actually fairly simple to explain.
Really quick, before you do that, do you not think that the probability of my existence is like, not that improbable given it's out of 8 billion? I mean, there are lots of people on Earth that are similar to me. I mean, similar enough to where I don't find it very improbable that I exist.
Well, I think that we have to be. I think that the thing is, when we talk about the probability of you existing, we have to be clear on. I'm going to sound like Jordan Peterson. We have to be clear on what we mean by you. So, because there could be a copy of you that exists somewhere else,
yep.
But that wouldn't be you. And so then the question is, what should your probability distribution be across the possible people you might be?
Yeah.
And what the self-indication assumption and the proponents say is that your probability distribution should be like spread evenly across the people who you might be, right? So imagine a coin. So to illustrate this, imagine a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, there's one guy created in one room. If it comes up tails, there's one guy created in one room and one guy created in the next room. Okay, suppose you come to be created, you don't know what room you're in. Well, I think you should say, well, there's a 50%, the odds that I'm the person in the first room and the coin came up heads equal the odds that I'm the person in the first room and the coin came up tails. And the odds that I'm the person in the second room and the coin came up tails equal the odds that I'm the person in the first room and the coin came up tails. And so you should have 2/3 credence that the coin came up tails. And so from that sort of basic style of reasoning, given that you don't know which of the possible, Graysons you are in the multiverse, you should think you get very strong evidence for a theory on which there are more versions of you. I know, it's a very confusing argument to think through. If people are curious to read more about it, I'd encourage you to read my article just on my blog called The Anthropic Argument for Theism. And then also read about the self-indication assumption. Joe Carl Smith, who's a philosopher, he has a series of blog articles called SIA greater than SSA, where he walks through this. And I also have some blog articles.
There's one more point that I want to get to before going to fine-tuning, because I do really want to get to fine-tuning, but there's one more point that I'm not getting about this. It seems like there's not an infinite number of possible different people. Like, why would I think that there's an infinite number of possible humans? Well, I know you try to explain it with the number line and stuff, but I would completely reject that if we have an infinite number line, that there could be one different unique person on each one of those numbers. I don't think that that's true.
Well, so we have to be clear on what we're talking about by unique person. So many of these people will have the same DNA and be like, the same in terms of their various traits. But I'm talking about like nature and nurture. I don't think that there's an infinite number of different possible people, like including every sum total of all things that make a person. So do you think that you can rule out the universe being infinite, because then you would just run out of people before you tiled the universe? Or sorry, do you think you can rule out the universe having infinite people in it?
I mean, to our knowledge, yes, but again, wait, hold on. The universe could be infinitely large, and in that case, there could be an infinite number of people in them. I just don't have any evidence that would suggest that's the case. At least I know you're saying that this argument is evidence, but there's it just seems like there's some flaw here when your conclusion is, well, I exist, therefore an infinite number of people exist, therefore a god is the one that's most likely responsible for creating an infinite number of people.
Yeah, I agree. It is weird, the idea that your existence gives you evidence that there are an infinite number of people. But when you get into the field of anthropics, which is the field about how to reason about your own existence, every view implies something weird. And I think you can show that if you adopt anything other than the self-indication assumption, you can get even weirder things. Like you can get
does the broken plate indicate an infinite number of broken plates?
The broken plate... So
there's a huge amount of different ways that plate could have broken, right?
Yeah, so it does in one. Yeah, so it does in one sense, in that from the fact that you break your plate, you should think that there are infinite. You get strong evidence there are infinite people in the universe who break their plate, right? Because it's very unlikely. Like, suppose there were only in the total all of the universe. Suppose there were only like 3 people who broke their plates. Well, it would be super unlikely that you would be one of the lucky 3. And so you do get evidence, but if there are 2 theories and one of the theories predicts that and like suppose there are these aliens on some faraway island or something, or not faraway island, sorry, faraway planet, and you're asking like, okay, from the fact that you break your plate, you get evidence that the aliens break their plate. You don't get evidence that the aliens break their plate, because them breaking their plate doesn't raise the probability that you would raise your plate. But so yes, you do get evidence that there are more people who break their plate, that there are more people with your relevant evidence who break their plate, but you don't get evidence for any like other particular person that they break their plate.
Okay. It's definitely a unique argument. I have linked your channel in the description if anyone wants to check that out in full. I don't know what exactly my objections would be, but like, the starting one is where I have issues with, and so I would really need to like probably read through the arguments for it and think about it to see if that very first step makes sense to me, which so far it doesn't. But let's go ahead and move on to fine tuning, right? Because like
Yeah.
I made a video on fine tuning. I believe that you've watched it. Um, I think my audience will probably know my thoughts about the general fine tuning argument, which is that I see no reason to think that the constants of nature are these things that are like on dials that can be tuned in to certain values, because everywhere we look, they're always the same value. They're constants. So what I know that, a physicist or a mathematician can change a 2 to a 3 in a math equation, but to me that's not indicative of that being a possibility. Like
Yeah.
I could draw a picture of 25 pounds outweighing 1,000 pounds, and that doesn't mean that it's like a possibility in reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So one question: are you a determinist?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you think that the things that happen are physically determined. But so imagine a person is playing poker and they get a bunch of royal flushes in a row. And someone
Uh-huh.
says, I think you're cheating. And they say,
Mhm.
no, no, no. The physical laws are such as to determine that I would get these things. That's
Mhm.
my view. And that, what's the evidence that they could be different such that it could be anything different? In that
Mhm.
case, I think you would say, no, you should still think that they're cheating. You still do get evidence that they're cheating. The cheating hypothesis, in some sense, makes it likelier that they would get that result. And so I think,
that it's fair to have a cheating hypothesis, but then you have to go look for evidence. Like if they are cheating, you should be able to uncover evidence of that cheating. Like they'll have some sort of system on their wrist, some
well, so,
machine or something, or the
so
cards will be irregular, right? You
yeah,
could uncover evidence of their cheating.
yeah. So suppose that you don't discover any system or anything like that, but the person just gets 30 royal flushes in a row. The odds of getting a royal flush is, I think, 1 in 4.5 million or something. So the odds
Mhm.
of that happening by chance are like 1 in 4.5 million to the 30th.
Yeah.
And so you accuse them of cheating, and they say, look, we have no evidence that it could be anything other than it is, because determinism is true. And so there are no existing physical possibilities of it being anything other than what it is. I think so. The way to think about probability, I think, in terms of things like this, is you think about it not in terms of physical possibility, so whether the physical laws could be such that they're different, but instead in terms of what's called epistemic possibility. So the idea of epistemic possibility is, imagine you hadn't observed the thing yet. What odds would you assign to it taking on various different values? And so given that if you didn't know what the laws of physics were, you would have no special preference for any specific value, then the probability of them falling in a narrow range by chance is very low. So like,
Why would I though? I don't understand why it's somehow advantageous to reason from a more epistemically ignorant position, right? Shouldn't I want to reason with the maximal amount of knowledge about the system?
yeah, you do reason about the maximal amount of knowledge, but the epistemic possibility, it's the way that I think that you should reason about it if you're deciding between probabilities of the things that might fix the physical laws. Because here's maybe a more analogous case. Suppose that we looked under the we discovered the initial conditions of the universe, and the initial conditions of the universe was all the particles and stuff were such that they spelled out made by God. Do you agree
Mm,
that that would give you strong evidence for the existence of God?
yeah, I mean it's
So
literally
why
written there.
Okay, so imagine if a person said, look, we have no evidence that the initial conditions could be anything else.
Mhm.
The probability of the initial conditions being what they are is 1. There aren't other things it could be, so therefore it's not evidence. Why would their reasoning be wrong?
Okay, this is good. Actually, this is good. On the face of it, um, that may overcome my objection. The only issue that I would have is whether or not. I mean, that's a little bit like disanalogous as I see it to reality, where obviously we don't have a signature that says made by God in the initial conditions of the
Right.
universe.
We don't have the signature that says made by God, but what we have is we have the laws, the constants, and the initial conditions that fall in a very precise and narrow range that's ideal for
Wait,
both
wait, wait.
for
what does that mean? A precise and narrow range. How is there a range?
So there's a range in the sense that there are lots of values that you could imagine them taking on, and they only take on, and for a variety of them, they take on this a value such that given the value they are, it gives rise to life.
But okay. So the example with the signature, right? It's not the improbability of the signature that is the reason why I would think that that's evidence for God, right? Because any any distribution would be equally improbable, but like one
right,
that specifically writes, you know, made by God.
right. It's not just enough for it to be an improbable distribution, because you're right, everything that happens is improbable. The cases where you infer that some hypothesis is where there's something that's improbable on the negate if some theory is false, but very probable if the theory is true. So
Mhm.
the reason why in the poker case you should infer that the person's cheating is because it's very unlikely that they would get a bunch of royal flushes if they weren't cheating, but much likelier that they'd get it if they were cheating. Similarly, in the God case, the initial conditions, you can imagine them taking on a whole range of values. And so it's very unlikely that they would say made by God if God didn't exist, while it's very likely if God did exist. And so that's why it gives you reason to think that God exists. But yeah, so I guess I'm curious, what's the distinction between the initial conditions being such that they spell out made by God and the initial conditions and laws and constants being finely tuned?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, in the first one, it's a literally writing in English made by God. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? That would be evidence of God.
And sorry, and why is it writing it out made by God? Why is that evidence for the existence of God? Because a person could argue exactly the way you have, where they could say, "Look, we don't have any like it's not like it could be anything else. We haven't seen a bunch of other initial conditions. It's not like we've observed the initial condition. It's not like there's some machine that generates a random set of initial conditions and it happened to be this one. We have no evidence that the initial conditions could be anything else. How's that different from the way you're reasoning?"
I think because the initial conditions are written in a language that didn't exist before humans came up with it and has semantic content that are very clearly a signature, I am God. If that's written in the initial conditions of the universe, written in English, um, that
But
just
I
seems, you know,
But I'm trying to understand because so you're saying that you're just describing what it means for the initial conditions to say made by God. You're saying, they spell out made by God in English and so on. But I'm trying to understand why that counts as evidence. Because here's my account of why it counts as evidence. The initial conditions could be a whole range of things. You could imagine it being any of a huge number of things. And it's ridiculously unlikely if there's no God, they would happen to be in this very narrow range of the possible values it could take on were made by God. And then I think the same thing implies that there are a whole range of outcomes that you could imagine it taking on, and and so you should assign a ability to it taking on the specific value where it's finely tuned. And so I'm trying to understand what's the relevant difference between the initial conditions saying made by God and the initial conditions, say, being finely tuned such that they give rise to life.
well, I think that in the first example with I am God, I think that you're right that it's way more probable given the existence of God versus the alternatives. And I would not expect the initial conditions to like have made by God written in them. But I don't think that that's analogous to the so-called fine tuning of the constants of nature because that's exactly what I would expect. I mean, it falls right in line with my naturalistic expectations.
Well, so why is it that you would expect finely tuned constants?
Um,
Because
because
it seems like there's nothing special about the cosmological constanting on this particular value that gives rise to interesting stuff, rather than some other of the huge number of possible values it could take on, where it would give rise to nothing interesting.
well, because obviously, like, and this would just be my reasoning for it, right? Like, because we would know that we are living in a universe that supports life, and so we would know that the constants would have to be such that it would support the existence of things like atoms and chemistry. Because we already have knowledge about the universe that we're in. That gives us information about what to expect the initial conditions to be and what to expect for the constants of nature in our physical equations, because ultimately our physical equations need to describe the reality that we're living in. So because we already have advanced knowledge of the reality we're living in, that gives us an expectation for what we should expect in these initial conditions, and they should be such that atoms and life and physics and chemistry are all possible as we know them. So that's
Yes.
what is shaping my expectation. There's nothing about um, anything I know about reality that would give me the expectation that the initial conditions should spell out in English "made by God." That would be a complete shock.
Yeah, well, so you're saying that we already have evidence in our background knowledge where we're already aware of this stuff that points to it being finely tuned. So let's imagine we were already aware of the made by God stuff. Like imagine that we had just known for the last,
Well, hold on, wait. I think I'm saying that specifically our physics is finely tuned to describe the universe. And so we would expect the initial conditions of the universe to reflect the way that we have finely tuned our equations to match observed reality. Like if our equations don't work and they don't match reality, we change them. We tune them to be closer to our actual measurements that we're doing. So like this is that was more so my point, I
wait,
guess. Would
I'm
be
not sure
like
if I'm not sure if I'm getting it. I like the puzzle is not about why our equations match the laws of physics. The puzzle is about why the laws of physics are what they are.
Yeah, but I'm saying like so the laws of physics are our descriptions of what's happening, right? And
Yeah.
our descriptions are finely tuned to match what is happening. So we have these constants at specific values because that's matches our actual observations. So when we're talking about going back to the initial conditions of the universe, like I would also expect to see those same constants at play. I would expect to see the same amount of fine tuning in our other physical laws.
Okay,
Like
so
it's basically an expectation value based on previous experiments and previous knowledge of reality.
right. So you're saying we already had the knowledge that the laws of physics, based on our experiments, that the laws of physics are finely tuned. But so, let's imagine that we already had the value based on our previous experiments that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God. Like, suppose this had been a discovery we made many thousands of years ago, and so, this is old news. It would still be very strong support for the existence of God, even though this is already supported by
Wow.
our
Can you
experiment.
spell that out a bit more?
Why it would be evidence? Well, I think a
Yeah.
lot of people that so if even if we had discovered a long time ago that the laws of physics, that the initial conditions said made by God, I think most people would say, yeah, that would still give you evidence that like it just seems intuitively like that would give us evidence. And
But
I think
why?
there's an
That's what I'm confused about. Is why
oh
would that?
so
Because it
the
doesn't
explanation.
intuitively give evidence to me.
Wait, so wait, sorry. Just to clarify, you're saying intuitively it doesn't seem to you that if we'd already discovered a long time ago that that the early condition of the universe had them in the formation spelling out made by God. You think if that
Oh, I
discovery
thought
had
we were talking about. I didn't know we were talking about the made by God analogy universe. I thought we were talking about our universe.
no, sorry, I was talking about the universe.
Okay.
So
Okay.
imagine
Wait, start over again. Sorry, because I thought you were talking about our current universe. I'm trying to
Yeah,
follow you.
yeah. So imagine our understanding of the universe saying starting in this condition made by God. You were saying, well, we already know that the conditions of the universe are finely tuned, but as a result of our experiments. So in this case, imagine we already know that the initial conditions of the universe were such that they spelled out made by God, and we'd known that for like 1,000 years.
Okay.
It was discovered in the time of Galileo somehow. Um,
Hmm.
would you agree that that would still give evidence for the existence of God?
Sure. Okay. I understand your point now. Yeah. I mean, I think that if we discovered that the initial conditions of the universe should spell out made by God, and we discovered it back in Galileo's time, then yes, it would still surprise me, and it surprised my expectations back when Galileo discovered it. You're just sort of pushing it down the road here.
Well, I mean, it actually did surprise our expectations when we discovered the fine tuning, right? So in both cases,
Did it?
yes.
What are you specifically referring to there?
Like, so I couldn't tell you the source off the top of my head, but I remember I was reading something about that Robin Collins wrote, where he talked it being surprising to people when they began to discover it in the 80s.
You cut out there a little bit there, but I think we got most of it. I don't know if there's something up with your connection or what. It just sort of, dropped the call quality there for a second.
Yeah, so I think early on when we discovered it was surprising. But I mean, surely like the thing that makes something evidence can't depend on whether the scientists at the time of discovering it found it surprising, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm saying like, it would be a shock if the initial conditions of our universe would say made by God. I don't think that it would be a shock that the initial conditions of our universe were such that life could exist because hey, we already know that the universe is such that life can exist.
But
Like,
right, so you're saying that it has to be the case that at the time that we discover it, um, that
well, I'm saying
like
that it should never be surprising that our universe has conditions such that life can exist
well,
because we already knew that from the get-go.
right. So from the get-go, we knew that we exist, right? So, but the fact that you exist can still be evidence for a hypothesis. So there's a famous case where called well, actually, I won't give the famous case. I'll give the less famous case. So from the fact that you exist, it seems you get evidence that your parents didn't use effective contraception in the sex act that produced you. And the reason why you get evidence for that is because the probability that you would come to exist is higher if they didn't use contraception than if they did. And so I think that even though you can say, look, we already know that you exist, and so it can't be evidence either way, because your existence is more strongly predicted on the hypothesis that they didn't than that they did, then it'll favor that hypothesis. And so similarly, the hypothesis
Okay,
that
look, I can grant you I exist, therefore my parents probably had sex. I think that that's quite fair to grant. So, I mean, how is that different
yeah,
than
the Holy
I
Spirit
exist,
didn't like
therefore the
intervene.
universe obviously has physics that allow for life. I mean, why would I conclude anything more than that?
Well, so the idea is that we want to look for the best explanation of why the physics has life, where you shouldn't just think that it's a brute coincidence, because the probability. So the way to think about it about evidence in Bayesian terms is you think about the prior probability of a theory, which is sort of imagine how likely you would think it was before you knew any evidence, even your own existence, right? You just imagine there was some like third party assessing, some third party disembodied spirit assessing the
I
probability.
literally I cannot imagine that. I don't know what that means. I mean, where
Yeah.
are they assessing this? They're not in the universe?
Right. So imagine they're just assessing it prior to looking at the universe. Like they just don't know
That
anything about the
just doesn't
universe.
make sense to me, right? Because the universe would contain space and time, so they can't assess anything without time. So I literally I cannot imagine what this would be.
Yeah. Well, so um yeah. So I mean it's
And I can't imagine uh being a third party without knowledge of existence. Like how could you be a third party capable of assessing anything if you can't if there's no time, there's no space and there's no knowledge of existence? Like it doesn't make sense.
right. So the idea and yeah, I mean so you're supposed to think it through in terms of the prior probability of a theory, which is how probable it is before looking at the evidence, and then you update proportional to how much the evidence is. And so a way to think about the priors is you sort of imagine how likely you would think it was before you'd looked at the evidence specifically. But like and it's sort of like a thought experiment. Like it can be hard to imagine, for example, in Rawls's veil of ignorance, it can be hard to imagine what it's like to be behind the veil of ignorance. What do you know? Okay, how do you not know who you are? Blah blah blah. But the idea is that it's a thought experiment to illustrate.
Well, I've been ignorant of things before, so I can imagine what it's like to be ignorant of certain things. Like that doesn't strain my imagination. Like straining my imagination is thinking about how I could do anything without time. Like to my understanding, like there's not time and space outside the universe.
Well, okay. Yeah, so I mean, maybe there's time. Maybe the spirit exists in some like alternative realm or something where they're just identifying. I mean, the basic idea is
the universe.
The basic idea is you're supposed to think about the probability of the thing if you hadn't looked at the evidence yet. And so, and
But,
beyond
okay,
that, you should try not to think about the details of the setup.
I
There
think
isn't a way to
in
make the
this
setup
instance,
realistic.
we actually cannot do that. Like we cannot assess the probability of the universe before there's a universe, because that doesn't make sense. Like,
Okay, well, so like here's a way to see why a reasoning like the Bayesian reasoning is useful. So imagine we're considering two hypotheses. Hypothesis one, go back to the case I described earlier with the nebula. Hypothesis one is that the nebula that go outside of our observable universe just disappear. You shouldn't believe that hypothesis, and the reason you shouldn't believe that hypothesis is that even though that theory explains the evidence just as well, it has a lower prior probability. It's less likely to be true. And so the idea is that the way to think about priors is the prior probability. It's how likely you should think it is before you look at the specific evidence. And then you update on the evidence to take into account the evidence.
so I can grant that, like, Bayes' probability is valid for our world as it is today. But I think that it breaks down along with all of our other physics at the very earliest moments of the universe. So I don't think that it can apply to something like the universe. So it's like literally our understanding of space, time, the laws of physics, they all break down before we get to like a singularity level. So like, why would Bayes' probability also be valid at that point?
Well, the laws of probability, they don't like go away at the beginning of the universe.
Why would they not? I literally cannot understand why they wouldn't.
Well, the way to think, like, just like, the fact that 1 + 1 = 2, that wasn't different at the beginning of the universe. The sort of mathematical facts don't depend on where you are located in space-time.
I don't know. I honestly, I don't know that that's the case.
Wait, so you think maybe there are some places in space-time where like 1 + 1 = 4 or something?
I have no idea. I mean, like, again, everywhere we look, these things are consistent. These things are constant. But like,
well, but
I mean, look, it could be possible. It could be possible that like 1 + 1 is always equal to 1. The law of identity always maintains. But like when we're getting to the point where we're starting talking about conditions where space and time might not even exist, 1 + 1 doesn't hold any meaning if there's like no time. If there's no space, then you can't have two different things being added. So like at that point, if you're getting to a part where there's no time or space anymore that you can't consider, then like everything, all of these notions ultimately depend on time and space as we understand them on like a macroscopic level. So that just seems to be an assumption that breaks down when you're talking about the very earliest moments of the universe.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the mathematical laws, just like the logical laws and the modal laws and so on, are the types of things that don't change no matter where you go in the universe.
Okay, can you imagine those laws maintaining when there's no space or time? Are you able to imagine that?
Well, it's hard to like think of the scenario with your mind, but I think like when I think about it, it seems very strange if the laws would be different. Like, I don't know, do you think that there could be like true contradiction? I mean, if you don't trust this kind of a priori reasoning, then I don't know how you avoid this kind of crazy skepticism. Or if you don't think that,
I trust that reasoning on macroscopic scales today, but it gets to a point like at the early stages of the universe where literally space and time breaks down and we don't understand what it even means anymore to have space or time. And at that stage, we don't have any tools, mathematical, physical, logical. None of our tools are equipped to describe what is going on in reality at that point. Well, it breaks all of our tools.
I don't think it breaks our mathematical tools, because I think that the mathematical laws are necessary. They're the types of things that can't be otherwise, which seem like, and that seems right when I think about it. It seems
even
like
if space and time were totally different.
Yeah, like if there, when prior to the Big Bang or something, it seemed, I don't think there could be, two things and two things which together are five things. That seems impossible.
But yeah, without space or time, you cannot have any mathematical function, right? I
You
mean,
can't do math without being in space and time, but that doesn't mean you can't apply math to things that are outside space and time.
I think he
Arguably,
does. I really
yeah,
do. I mean,
I mean that just doesn't follow.
okay. I we should clarify. I don't think that the actual, like, the current laws of mathematics would apply to things where space and time, like, are no longer
So
applicable. I
you
do
think
think
maybe
I do think that maybe a different kind of physics or math may be necessary. Like, it may be the case that eventually we find, like, a new physics that quantum mechanics and general relativity and all of our current physics emerges out of, like a more fundamental layer that doesn't have space or time as fundamentals. And there could be some sort of math or physics that's capable of describing it. But it seems to me that our current laws of math, our current laws of physics, our current understanding of how reality works emerges from that more fundamental level rather than describing it. You know,
yeah.
making sense?
Well, so you think maybe there were like only finite prime numbers prior to the Big Bang?
I don't think that there were any of that prior to the Big Bang. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I just don't know
you and I
about.
clearly have very different views on philosophy of math. But I don't know. I don't think that this will. I mean, so do you agree that prior to the Big Bang, we should look for one thing that unifies the value of the constants? Like, suppose, and I don't
No.
know very much about physics, but I think my sense is that one of the reasons why string theory was attractive is that you could just posit these strings, and then that you could use that to explain why all the values in physics took on the
Yeah.
values that we did. If that project had been successful, do you agree that would have been a reason to believe in string theory over the theory that those things were just brute?
Well, the string theorists would say that they were successful.
Right. So
They were able to successfully unify everything in one mathematical description, and they say that there's real mathematical beauty in their description and how they've unified everything. The issue with string theory is that they couldn't get any test. It was not falsifiable because everything where they would have a prediction was at a level that was inaccessible to us. That was the problem with string theory. So they would say that they have done what you're describing. But my issue with the initial setup was you saying prior to the Big Bang. And that's a question that I'm not even sure if it makes sense. Like, it doesn't seem like there necessarily was a prior to time. Like, if time is emergent and is not fundamental, what does it mean to be prior to the emergence of time?
Yeah, or like absent time or something.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So
yeah, it is kind of hard
down
to think
it
about.
breaks down my understanding of, like, how I even conceptualize reality at that point, because we're just getting to a point where our toolkit no longer describes what's going on. So I just have to turn up my hands and say I don't know. I don't know if there's a prior to the Big Bang. I don't know if, like, things
But I mean,
that
so
are
like,
mathematics which rely on, like, certain relations in space and time would make sense without them.
but I mean, so if we got this really elegant mathematical formalism where from these very simple things behaving in a certain
Yes.
mathematical way, that just predicts the precise values of all the constants. It predicts that
Yeah.
they are exactly what they are. Uh, do you agree that would be strong evidence for that theory?
Well, that's what the string theorists claim that they have.
Well, I think if they really have that, I think then we should be string theorists.
There are plenty of string theorists that will make that exact argument. They will say, look, mathematically,
Well, I think
this
they're right.
is just too beautiful. They say this is too beautiful mathematically. It explains too much. The only thing is that you have to add like 10 other dimensions. But then all the math works, it explains everything. And they're making the argument that this is just mathematically, there are too many things that work out perfectly with the framework of string theory. But the physics community has kind of moved beyond string theory because it's been decades and still no empirical or empirically testable predictions or results.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily think you need empirical testable predictions to think that something's your best bet of the nature of reality. Like, I think, there hasn't been any most historical claims don't have empirical tests where you make a prediction in advance and then it turns out true. But we still believe them because they best explain the evidence. And so if string theory works like that, then I think maybe you should be a string theorist. Okay, here's another analogy.
I would clarify. I'm quite sympathetic to string theory. I like string theory, and I agree with you that it might be that human knowledge gets to a certain point where we're no longer able, like it's just in physical reality, that the way that humans are and the way that our reality is, that we're not capable of accessing these deepest layers. But we may be able to have some sort of mathematical description or physical description of it that's just not testable. And it's like, where do you go from there? I mean, then it's just, do I believe this or do I not, or what? And
well, I think in a case like that, what you do is you look at theoretical virtues. So you want to come up with a theory that has the most explanatory power, that's the simplest, that makes the most sense of the data. And so if string theory does that, if it's very simple and it makes sense of all the data and so on and so forth, then you should be a string theorist.
The only question is whether or not you want to swallow there being 10 extra dimensions or whatever.
Yeah, that's a little weird, but right. So, but I mean, the basic point is just if you have a very simple theory and then it naturally explains the values, the constants. I think that view. Would you agree that at least counts in favor of string theory? That from these simple starting points, you can
not from an empirical level, but maybe from just my own personal sympathies, maybe. But like, I do think that a lot of these. Sorry, what was that?
Just briefly, should you think string theory is more likely because it explains these things than if it didn't explain these things?
Well, if it didn't explain them, then I mean, yeah, I guess I can see what you mean, but I'm not gonna put much credence into it unless there's actual empirical evidence.
Yeah. Well,
I think that's just how physicists generally approach things, is that reality is the ultimate arbiter of truth. And if you can't test your theory, then, you can't possibly tell if it's true or not.
Yeah. Well, so wait, so going back to the point about the initial conditions spelling out made by God. I'm still unsure about why you wouldn't try to explain that away. Why, what you would, it seems like what you could say is, look, we know that the initial conditions spell it made by God. We have no evidence that it's physically possible for them to spell at any other value. We're aware that the initial conditions spell it made by God. So how can it be evidence for the existence of God? Or imagine, it doesn't have to be the initial conditions. Maybe, imagine just from the first days of the human race, from the first day humans got language, the sky and whatever the first language was spelled out, made by God, and that language. Do you agree that would be good evidence for the existence of God?
Yeah, and I think that my reasoning would be basically like, so like many of the things that are described as like fine-tuned constants or whatever, like I said, like we already had working knowledge of them, so we were able to predict what the initial conditions should be like, or we're able to predict what the shape of the cloud should be like, etc. But like, so it would be different if we actually had a working theory that would tell us, that says, okay, well, based on what we already know about reality, when we look at the initial conditions, it should spell out I made by God because of X, Y, and Z reasons. That would be different. And we have that currently for a lot of these, fine-tuned constants or whatever. Like it used to be considered that Fermi's constant was a fundamental constant of nature. And then we learned more about quantum physics and learned, hey, this is why Fermi's constant has the value that it does, because there's some more underlying, more fundamental physics at play here that explains exactly why this constant has this value. And that's happened before in our understanding of physics. Things that we thought were fundamental constants turned out not to be fundamental and had explanations from more fundamental physics about why they have the value that they do have. And so when I look around, I see, well, very clearly, we have not reached bedrock with physics yet. I mean, we have plenty of physics that we don't know about. Quantum gravity, I mentioned before. There are lots of more fundamental physics that we do not have descriptions of yet. So it seems more likely for me to think that a lot of these current constants that, like, we might not know why this constant has a certain value. We've never seen any evidence that it can have another value. But if you're asking why specifically this value, it seems more likely, based on the track record of the history of science, that there's probably more fundamental physics going on that would explain why it has the value that it has, because it's happened before that way.
Yeah, so now you're appealing to these more fundamental laws. So what if a person appealed to the more fundamental laws to explain why the initial conditions said made by God? They say, look,
Yeah.
maybe there's these more fundamental laws that
Then I would
mean.
no longer consider it to be evidence for God.
Wait, okay, so it wouldn't. So then you wouldn't consider it evidence to be God, because a person could always say maybe there's a more fundamental theory that explains why it says made by God.
If they had that theory, I mean,
No. Imagine they don't have the theory, just like people don't
okay,
have the theory about that avoids fine tuning of the constants.
yeah.
Like it's not like there's some
Then,
specific theory.
okay, so for me personally, I think that there's a difference between having something that spells out made by God and then just having a universe that supports life. I consider these to be two completely, separate magnitudes. Like, one, I definitely would say is evidence that the universe is made by God. If it literally spelled out made by God, like, yes, I would consider that evidence, because it boggles my mind that there could be an actual underlying physics to describe why that is. But if somebody was capable of coming out and explaining it, and I could go over it and say, oh, actually, that does make sense. I thought it was evidence for God, but now it's been explained, and there you go. Curiosity satiated. But just, I don't think that it's anywhere even in the same ballpark of comparing, like, literally the universe spelling out made by God versus the universe supporting life. I don't think that those are even that comparable.
Yeah, well, so you're saying that the difference is that there could be a more fundamental explanation
Mhm.
of why they spell out made by God,
It could be.
but or sorry, you think that it's more likely that there's a more fundamental explanation of our current laws than it is that there's a more fundamental explanation of of them spelling out made by God.
Yes. That was
Um,
actually worded better than I could have even done it myself, so thank you. Yes.
yeah. So I guess so I think that in the made by God case, you could come up with a more fundamental theory. You could come up with some theory about the particles being disposed to be in a certain way. But I mean, so here's I think the more crucial conceptual problem. So think back to the poker case. The guy gets a bunch of royal flushes in poker, and you say, "I think you're cheating," and you're like, "No. I'm a determinist. This is determined by these more fundamental physical laws."
Mhm.
That's not a good explanation, because the more fundamental physical laws, in an epistemic sense, they could make it take on anything. There could be more fundamental physical laws that take on any of a wide range of values. And so the thing that becomes a coincidence is that there are fundamental laws which are such as to bring about initial conditions. Which are such as to bring about the game of poker where they get a bunch of royal flushes. And so
I think
similarly,
my issue with the analogy for the cheating at poker is
well,
just that cheating at poker is a falsifiable hypothesis, right? You can check. I
Well,
mean,
imagine in this case you can't check. Maybe suppose you read about a poker game that was played 1,000 years ago, where all you know about it is the guy got 100 royal flushes in a row.
okay, then I mean, look, I would probably, yeah, if it's 100 royal flushes and each one has 1 in 4 billion or whatever,
Four and
it
a
would
half million.
strain my mind to think that that is a coincidence. I would think he's probably cheating. But again, I wouldn't say he was cheating. I would say he's probably cheating.
Um,
But again, if it's that in the past, I grant you that,
wait, so
it's
wait,
hard
so
to
you
check.
would say he was probably cheating?
Yeah. I think this is something that you touched on earlier, right? About like subjective chance versus objective chance. Like,
Yeah.
if I just have a feeling, like, a subjective chance is just how confident I am about something. And I would be, more confident that he's cheating than he was not cheating. And it was a coincidence.
Yeah. So, right. So, and I would be very sure he was cheating, or that someone else was cheating on his behalf, or something weird was. I would be very confident that he didn't just get 100 royal flushes in a row by chance.
I mean,
And I
improbable things happen all the time. So I would never rule it out unless there was actual evidence establishing that he was cheating. And
well,
I would say that it's more probable that he was not cheating if a thorough investigation was done and they found no evidence, then that increases the probability that he was not cheating.
Well, yeah. So improbable things do happen, but you should think if you know I one of two things happened. Either a slightly improbable thing or a super duper duper improbable thing that is more improbable than anything that's ever happened in the history of the world, such that, if you keep running the event, throughout the entire universe, you'd expect it to happen 0 times. No, you should think the less improbable one happened. And
Yeah.
so in this case, I think you should think that the less improbable event is the person cheating than the person just getting 100 royal flushes in a
So
row.
how do we map this onto the universe and this fine-tuning situation?
So I
Because
was saying,
I don't see how you can have any probability for the universe, like,
so
at all.
suppose a person said, I don't see how you can have any probability with this physical chance stuff. Whatever things they got in the game of cards, that was determined by the laws of physics. There aren't other laws of physics that
No,
they could.
I agree. I'm a determinist, so I agree. I think that probabilities are ultimately like epistemological, right? It's just about
Yeah,
your
well, I agree. Probabilities are epistemic, at least in most cases. I think you talk about other kinds of probability, but if a person said, "Look, in this case, the person, they can't get, you have no evidence that they're cheating because you're trying to infer that they're cheating from this event, but you have no, you're saying, oh, this is an improbable event. How do you know it's improbable?
well, we can
For it,
establish the probabilities for a card game.
how do you establish the probabilities? They say, well, you can establish, all these other things. These are just made up probabilities. You have no evidence that it's consistent
Well,
with the
you
laws of
repeat
physics.
the instance. You draw, what is it, 5 cards or whatever, and you calculate the probability based on the repetition of the act. You can calculate what the probability of a royal flush is,
Yeah,
because
but
you can do it
well,
multiple times.
yeah. So there is the probability of of just a random game of cards being uh, having a royal flush. But he would say, look, what we're talking about isn't the odds of a random game of cards having a royal flush. We're talking about the odds that this particular game of cards that I played 1,000 years ago would have this royal flush. And we have you're saying, oh, it can be all these different things. I could have gotten any value other than a royal flush. No, it couldn't. The laws of physics are deterministic, so it couldn't be anything else. And we have, it's not an improbable event. It can only be an improbable event if there are a bunch of different outcomes that it could be. But whatever happens here in the royal flush
So
is determined by
this
more
is this
fundamental
is just
physics.
a probability doesn't work for the past. It only works for the future, right? It's just you can't calculate
No,
probabilities of
what?
a past event because the probability was always 100% in the past.
You can calculate the probability of a past. Like, I think there's a very high probability that Julius Caesar existed.
Okay, that's a subjective probability. Like, if we're talking about like objective probabilities, the probability of all past events is 100%, basically. Like, they could not have been any different. But like when we're
Well,
talking about, because again, probability is epistemic, where you can only calculate them for future events that haven't happened yet. You can't do probabilities for past events because it's always 100%.
well, I think that probability being epistemic doesn't mean you can't do it for past events. Like, you can say that you can do it for past events, but when you're doing it for past events, you're talking about epistemic possibility, right? So when we
You're talking
talk
about
about,
subjective probability, basically.
yeah,
You're talking,
right,
and at that point, it's less so like objective mathematical. It's more so of just a gauge of your confidence about something. That's
well,
a
I don't
subjective
think it's
part.
just I don't think it's just a gauge of your confidence. You can have it be a gauge of what a person's like. There are cases where your confidence is justified. So, for example, in the past, suppose 2 years ago, some people played a game of cards. I have a pretty high subjective probability that they didn't get a royal flush. It's possible that they did, but I think it's very unlikely, and I think that's
Mhm.
justified.
No, that's a
And
subjective probability, though.
yeah,
Like,
well,
in
okay,
terms of
right.
object probabilities, like this happens in like quantum mechanics as well. The wave function only applies to the present and future. You don't do that with the past. You don't do any probabilistic, like the probabilistic nature of
Wait,
quantum
sorry.
mechanics does
Well,
not apply to the past.
why wouldn't the same thing apply to the future? Like, if
It does
determinacy is
apply to the
true,
future.
okay, so then you just can't do any
Oh, wait,
any.
sorry. Were you saying that the same thing as in you can't calculate probabilities?
Yeah.
Okay, because our knowledge of the future events and our knowledge of current initial conditions is limited, and so we're epistemically
But our
limited,
knowledge of
and
the
so that's
past
why
is also
probabilities
limited.
apply to the future. But for past events, we know what the outcome was.
But we don't know. No, we don't. There are some past events where we don't know what happened. Like I don't know the outcome in the game of cards.
But okay, so but we do know the outcome, right? Because you're saying what is the
There's some things
probability of
that
getting
happen,
this
but we don't
outcome?
know what happened specifically.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that in statistics, in mathematics and physics, probabilities apply to like current and future events and not past events in terms of objective probabilities.
Well, so generally, the way that in objective probability, the way people think about it is they say if you keep if you take whatever relevant sample is and you keep
Yes.
rerunning it, what will the limit be of the frequency of various outcomes?
And so that's what I'm saying for the cards. That's how we can calculate the probabilities. And I'm saying for the universe, we can't do that.
Yeah. Um, well, but I agree that we can't do that because we don't have like it's not like there's some universe generating die that keeps
Yes,
rolling and
exactly. We only have a
generate.
sample size of one. So I'm not familiar with how you can ever do probabilities with a sample size of one, unless it's just subjective probabilities, which again, I think is just basically a gauge of how confident you are about something. And that's going to vary subjectively.
But I think subjective probabilities it can have they can have a sort of bad name where it sounds very wishy washy and subjective, but there can be justified and unjustified. So
Yes.
like
There are going to be people that are more rigorously coming about their level of confidences based on certain
right,
evidence or
and there are lots
arguments.
of cases where you should be super confident in something, even though it's based on your subjective probability.
Yes, I
Like
agree.
yeah, and
But that
so
would just be a high subjective probability, right? And that's,
well,
pretty
just
valid.
we're talking about how confident you should be in it. And so
Yeah.
similarly, I think that from the fine tuning evidence, you should be should be very confident in the existence of God because the subjective probability, if there is no God, of the laws of physics turning out in a very narrow range is very low. Well, it's very
Why?
high if there is God. Sorry, can I just get water very briefly and I'll return in a
Yeah,
moment.
no worries, no worries.
Yeah, I'll answer the question. Okay.
I'm gonna cover a different news story that's a fun one for the audience, while you're gone.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, I did have one more science news story, but I really wanted to cover this because it really made me laugh a little bit. So, okay, are you guys ready? This is our news in sometimes we do science news, sometimes we do like geopolitical news, sometimes like last week we did news about a new prophecy of God. So this week we're going to cover a new saint. God's influencer is going to become the next saint. This is going to be the first millennial saint in history, the first saint of my generation. I am a millennial. So this guy was born in 1991, and apparently he's nicknamed God's influencer. And just this last week, Pope Francis cleared the way for God's influencer to become the first millennial saint. And yeah, his story is kind of wild. He died at like age 15, and he's got a really creepy tomb, and like people worship him for like performing miracles like after he died. Apparently, and I'm going to show you his tomb here because it's super creepy. So this is his tomb. He died in 2006. So this is, he's just preserved like this. Very creepy. Very creepy. A 15-year-old boy in jeans and sneakers preserved in this very weird display. And people come here and they pray to him and they ask him to heal them, and perform miracles on them. And apparently the Pope said, look, this dead 15-year-old kid has done too many miracles. He's healed too many sick people that now we got to recognize him as a saint. So he's going to be the next saint. Yeah, pretty wild. So we got a new saint this week, a new millennial saint. So everybody can look forward to that. Sorry about that, Matthew. Thanks for coming back. I just wanted to cover that news story because
Yeah,
I
no
thought it
worries.
was
Yeah,
fun.
I caught the end of it. Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah,
So you
his
were
name,
asking.
his name is God's influencer because he was a web designer. I guess at age 15 or something, he was good with computers, and he established like a website cataloging different Catholic miracles.
Yeah. So you were asking why the epistemic probability should be low, conditional in atheism. Well,
Yeah.
so if there's a certain event that could take on a wide range of values, and none of the values taking it on has any greater like theoretical virtue, like it's not simpler or anything, then you should think that the odds of it taking on any very specific value, the epistemic probability of that, is super low.
Well, I
Okay.
agree, but I'm asking why should I presuppose that there is this range of possibilities?
Well, so when I was talking about possibility, I was talking about in an epistemic sense. So I'm just saying if there are lots of values that you could imagine it taking on,
Yeah.
then if it takes on one very specific value that's that's predicted by one theory, while the other theory you could imagine consistent with that theory it taking on any of a range of values and there's nothing special about any one of them, then that would favor the first theory.
Sure, but again, I think that at this point we've been gathering lots and lots of evidence, and every time we ever try this, the constants are the same values that they're always measured to
But
be.
you're talking about physical possibility, and I'm talking about epistemic possibility. So the idea here, we're talking about just suppose, and I mean, we're going to go back to the Bayesian thing that you didn't like, but the idea is just, because the constants, because the naturalism is consistent with it taking on any of this huge range of values. And all of those, there's nothing special about any of the values other than matching our observations. The probability conditional on naturalism of it falling in the scenario range is very low. Now, and then
I
it
don't
does.
I don't grant that.
Well, so the point right. So you don't grant it, but I think if you don't grant it, you're going to have trouble explaining lots of things about probability. So there are cases where, with the initial conditions being spelled out made by God, I think that in a case like that, that gives you strong evidence. Even if you say maybe there's some more fundamental theory that says, they're disposed to spell it made by God. I think that because you could imagine a more fundamental theory
Yeah.
that disposes them to bring about a whole range of outcomes.
Well,
I think
I agree with you on that. On the made by God, I thought that was a very, very good objection that you have to my position here. I do, and I think that what you said earlier about the outcome being more likely um, given the God hypothesis than not. I think that applies there. I don't think that necessarily applies here, though. When we're talking about a universe that is capable of supporting life, I don't think that's. I don't think we can say that that's more likely than the alternative that there is no God universe. I don't see how you're making that determination.
Well, so I think that the reason is that the reason why in the made by God case we think that's evidence is that the universe could be in a whole range of initial conditions, and only a minute portion of the initial conditions that you could imagine it being in, only a very minute portion of them end up having it be, say, made by God. And so for that reason, the probability conditional on naturalism of it saying made by God is very low, and the odds on theism also pretty low, but not as low.
I just don't think that just because you can imagine this, I just don't think that just because you can imagine these values as having different values, that should factor into our probabilities.
Well, so I think if you don't think, because I think that's the way you get epistemic probability, where you think about the range of outcomes that you could imagine happening and how likely you would think it is conditional on the hypothesis. And I think if you don't think about it that way, then you have trouble explaining lots of other things. So, okay, here's another analogy. Imagine we discover that our universe was created by some other universe. This is going to be a slightly convoluted analogy, but imagine we discover our universe was created by some other universe. Okay, and there are two possibilities. Possibility one is that the universe there's some natural process like a black hole where the laws of physics in our universe end up just copying over the laws of physics in their universe. Okay. And possibility two is that there were some aliens who, managed to, through their experiments, create another universe with the laws of physics that they desired to create. Okay, so imagine we're deciding between those two hypotheses. Somehow, in science fiction fashion, we exit our universe, we go into the universe that created us, and we go into the alien laboratory. and we're reading about the aliens' plans for creating a universe. We don't know if their plans worked, and they say, "Oh, we want to create." The law of gravity like this, and they describe in detail our exact law of gravity. And we want to create, the weak nuclear force and the strong cosmological constant. And
So they're just describing our exact universe,
right, in great detail. And imagine somehow we know the aliens, they're not modeling it on their own physics. Let's say they don't even know what their own laws of physics are. They just,
okay, well, that's kind of strange belief. If they're capable of creating a new universe, you'd think that they would understand what their current universe.
Yeah, the aliens, they're just not at all interested in that for some reason. I mean, it's just a thought. It's
I'm
very
not.
robotic.
This is not computing already, but okay.
Yeah. So then
I would agree. I'll agree with you that if we went to this aliens and we saw that their plans for the universe was our exact universe, that would increase the probability that the aliens created our universe. I get that.
Yeah. So so why would that be?
Because on the one hand, we don't know what the other process that would create our universe would be. On the other hand, we know that the aliens tried to create our exact universe, and our exact universe exists. That seems like too big of a coincidence.
Right. And so I think a similar thing about fine-tuning, that it seems like too big of a coincidence. So more precisely in the alien case, so you say we don't know.
Wait. What? But you're thinking, but you're in the alien plan, the aliens' plans for the universe were our exact universe. But in your God plan, it's not. In your God hypothesis, the perfect universe is one with infinite amount of people, and that's not the universe that we observe around us.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the probability on so I agree that our universe is maybe not like, if all you knew is that there was a God, you'd think the odds of our universe existing was pretty low. Just like you'd think the odds of our universe existing was pretty low in atheism. But there's this feature of the universe, namely that there are finely tuned constants that favors theism over atheism. And I think
too, dude.
I think when you take into account all the features,
your argument that you just made with the aliens and their plan of the black hole is proof against God. At least your conception of God, that you're saying that a perfect God would create an infinite amount of people because that's the best, maximally good thing for him to do. And the world that we currently live in, observationally, does not have an infinite number of people. Therefore, that's evidence against your God.
How do you know it doesn't have an infinite number of people?
Because we look around. I'm not saying we know that doesn't, but I'm saying that observationally, our evidence is contrary. Our evidence shows us that all the people on Earth.
Yeah, well, it says there aren't.
If we looked around and we can see that there are people on all the other planets, and it extended infinitely, then yeah, that would be better evidence for your God. But because we're not, every planet we look at doesn't have more people.
Yeah, well, so but I mean, the same number of people exist in the universe if it's infinite size, no matter how densely packed it is, right? It doesn't matter whether you have people on every planet or just on every 10th planet. It would still be aleph null people.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, from what we know about our universe, from what we currently know about our universe, it seems like the evidence is going the other way for your God. Like, it seems like if there are infinitely many people, we've seen a lot of the universe, not all of it, but we've seen a lot. Not very many exoplanets, but
I think our evidence favors the idea that the universe, like the apparent flatness of the universe, if that's true, then the universe has infinite people.
Well, it doesn't necessarily follow, because there are other explanations for the spatial flatness of the universe, but
wait, sorry. Okay, you obviously know the physics better than I am. I'm not a science guy, but wouldn't the universe being flat just mean the universe is infinite in size?
No, not necessarily. Like I said, Neil Turok has an excellent paper from I think just 2023, explaining why, when you look at the overall cosmological entropy, meaning the total number of microstates that the universe can occupy, that it could be, and again, there's a little bit of mathematics here that's pretty dense. It makes some assumptions that I wouldn't necessarily go all the way along with, but he shows that at least the most probable spatial curvature of our universe is flat. just in terms of the overall number of different possible states that the universe could be in, the vast majority of them are spatially flat.
Okay, but you're saying we have good evidence that the universe doesn't have infinite people, that there aren't infinite people from observing our universe. And I'm
saying
saying
that we have, yeah, our evidence for that is that we haven't seen any of them yet.
yeah, well, but I don't think we have good evidence either way. And so I don't think you can say, well, our universe doesn't have infinite people. Where, first of all, even if our universe didn't have infinite people, that would be fine. Because my
Let me
claim
just
isn't
say,
that.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying our universe doesn't have infinite people. I'm not saying our universe is not infinite. I'm just saying from what our current evidence shows, our current empirical evidence, all of the people are on Earth.
Yeah. Well, so right. So I agree. Our evidence doesn't tell us either way. But then I think you can't say, well, this is good evidence against theism because our evidence tells us that there aren't infinite people. We don't know if our
Well,
evidence. We
your
don't know.
hypothesis is that, the God hypothesis, the prediction is that there should be an infinite number of people if God is perfectly good. Then there should be an infinite number of people. And then we look around, and what our current evidence shows us is that there's 8 billion people.
Well, but I don't think that you say our current evidence shows us that there are 8 billion people. I think our current evidence shows us that there are at least 8 billion people, but we have no idea how many the total number of people are because we don't know if there's a multiverse and we don't know how many people there are in our universe.
Sure, but I think that the probability is pretty low until we find one other person outside of Earth. If we find one other person, at least one other person outside of Earth, then I'll say, hey, wait a minute. Now, all of a sudden, your hypothesis is looking a lot more likely.
Wait, so would you believe in God if we found aliens?
No, I'm just thinking it would be your hypothesis would be more
Yeah, it would
likely.
raise. Okay, yeah. So I agree. I agree. It would raise the probability. So it would raise it a bit, but I don't think the absence of aliens is that strong of evidence because maybe if there was a God who made every possible person, maybe we'd see aliens, but maybe we wouldn't. I don't know. I think
It
it's
just seems like, if this God made infinite number of people, and he decided to space these infinite number of people so far away that they couldn't be aware of the others, it seems kind of like a trick that he would have played. Like, if it really is the case that evidence of an infinite number of people would be strong support for the existence of God, it kind of seems like he'd be tricking us into thinking there's no God if we can't find all these other infinite people.
well. I mean, I don't think. I think it would be evidence, but I don't think it's like
Okay,
it's not
here we go. Let me try this one. So,
obviously evidence.
if God is perfectly good, then he could not trick us to think that he didn't exist. So then a perfectly good God should show us evidence of its existence.
Well, I think we have enough evidence of his existence for that supports it. But I think it's very clear that if there's a good God, that God he's not trying to like make his existence maximally obvious, right? He
But
could.
wouldn't that be maximally good?
But I don't know why would it be? Like I think it might be good or it might not. There might be some value that comes from waiting before we know of his existence. What's the great value that you think would come of
So
everyone knowing
so
about his
you would
existence?
earlier you said that creating people is good, and so therefore he would make an infinite number of people. But isn't creating people that know truth better than creating ignorant people?
Yeah, in general, all else equal, knowing the truth is good.
So
But
wouldn't God create people that knew of his existence?
but it's not clear that all else is equal. Um, knowing about the existence of God, there might be various ways in which it would kind of like undermine people's motivation if they know that there's God looking over their shoulder. I have a complicated theodicy that I could go into if you want, but I think it would take us a little bit far afield from fine tuning.
Typically, I do like to keep these streams at around 2 hours, so we are kind of like hitting the back end of that. So,
Yeah,
but
I guess
it's been very interesting to talk to you, Matthew. I think that you're sharp. You've got like good arguments that did make me think. Um, and yeah, I mean, is there anything like what did you think of this conversation so far?
yeah, I enjoyed it. He seemed like an interesting guy. Continue debunking, flat Earth and young Earth creationist pseudoscience. Yeah, thanks for having me on. If people are curious to read more about my stuff on fine tuning, I have an article that you can find on my blog. My blog is just Bentham's newsletter called something like "The Fine Tuning Argument Simply Works." So if you type in, I think if you just type into Google, "The Fine Tuning Argument Simply
And
Works,"
so you do consider the fine-tuning argument. You said that there is sufficient evidence for the existence of God, and so I'm taking it to mean that you think that the fine-tuning argument is sufficient evidence.
I don't know if it would be sufficient on its own, because I think there's a lot of evidence against the existence of God as well. Like, I think the problem of evil drastically lowers the probability of the existence of God.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but yeah, that does seem to be sort of a big thorn in the side of the idea that God is perfectly good. Is that
Yeah.
you said, oh, well, a perfectly good God would create infinite numbers of good people. Well, there aren't, not every person is good. So that seems to be kind of a hole in that prediction.
Well, I think we would expect God to create people whose lives end up good, right? So if a person lives, has a shitty 30 years, but then in the afterlife their life is infinitely good,
So
then
you
God would.
believe in an afterlife?
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah,
How?
because it.
Okay,
Well, how?
interesting.
Like, my mind is disposed. I mean, the reason I believe in the afterlife is that, well,
I
they're
thought you were
actually.
like a deist, basically.
No, I'm not a deist. I'm a theist, but I'm not. I don't think any of the major religions are right. But yeah, I am a theist. Yeah, I think there's an afterlife, because it would be sort of weird if, after just allowing us to live for 40 years, or hopefully more than 40 years, like 80 years, just God just snuffed us out and that was it. That would seem kind
Maybe
of
that's the
shitty.
maximally good thing to do.
Well, wouldn't it be better to allow us to live on, and continue living a good life forever?
Not if human consciousness is not equipped for infinite life. Like if it would just naturally create an inordinate amount of suffering for human consciousness to have an infinite lifespan, then it would not be good to have an afterlife.
You don't think God could think of a way of making forever interesting?
I guess he could. I mean, if he could do
Yeah,
anything,
that's
then
what
I
I
would
think he
have
would
to
do.
think that, but I don't see that as being compatible with humans. Like there are plenty of humans that live interesting lives and they're still not happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, but in the afterlife, God is equipped to give us whatever ingredients we need for us to be happy.
See, I,
Um,
I really thought that you were a theist that like so okay. Do you think that God intervenes in reality?
I'm kind of undecided. Maybe. Like, I think there are some cases, some like pretty well evidenced miracle claims. So I think maybe he intervenes there, but I think it's very weird because it doesn't seem like the type of thing that he would intervene for. Like, for example, there was a case in the 16th century of a guy named Joseph of Cupertino, where like he was seen flying in religious contexts by hundreds of eyewitnesses who wrote sworn affidavits about this. They provided very similar descriptions of this.
Hmm.
Yeah, maybe he didn't, but like I don't know,
So
like
this
the
is
nat.
exactly like the hundred hands of the royal flush in the past, right?
Yeah, right. Like it's hard to imagine 100 people like mistakenly thinking someone flew.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I certainly enjoyed having you on. Like I said, philosophy is a little bit out of my bag, but I still really enjoy talking about it. So, thanks for having challenging some of my arguments, making me think. I appreciated having you on, Matthew. So,
Yeah.
hopefully
Thanks
we
for
can
having
talk again
me.
sometime.
Yeah, happy to come again sometime if you want to talk more philosophy. If not, no worries. And yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, have a good one.
Cool. I'll be interested to see how your views evolve over time.
All right. All right. Have a good night.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you everyone if you made it to the end of that. I know that that was pretty heady, a lot of detailed, kind of highfalutin arguments there. So I appreciate you sticking around for that. You know that I've really been wanting to have a fine tuning debate here for a while now, so that kind of scratched that itch. So still working on getting that CMB video out for you soon. Best evidence for the Big Bang and our current cosmological model. And I still am looking to set up some debates. Actually, I'm setting up a Big Bang debate currently over on SFT's channel for when I get back, because as some of you know, that in June, I am going to be going on a dinosaur fossil hunting expedition with Doc Dino in Wyoming. So, again, wish us luck on that. We're really looking to dig up a juvenile sauropod. It's been a lifelong dream of mine to dig up a dinosaur video. So, yes, look out for what I've got coming down the pipeline. I'm still trying to get together with Nathan, the flat earther. And so, yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Please like the video and leave me a comment about what you thought of tonight's discussion. So, yeah, without any further ado, I will be back next week, next Thursday, to discuss the science news. And yeah, keep staying curious and stay learning.